Hi, this is Owen from Embren Games, bringing you a Sunshard Embren battle report featuring the Warbands for the Shardborn and Remnant faction. Today's battle report's also going to cover some of the basics of the game because I know a lot of folks out there, particularly those on our Kickstarter, running until December 19th, 2024, have been asking for an overview of how the game plays. So, let's check out some of the basic rules for Sunshard Embren. Sunshard Embren is a D20 system, but unlike a lot of other systems, rolling low is good, so save those dice that aren't working for you for D&D. Let's go through an example of how an attack roll might work so people can see how the system operates. Let's pretend a Remnant Initiate wants to make an attack against a Shardborn Tremor. The Initiate is going to look at one of the weapons to attack with, let's say his spear, and look at the attack ability, or AA, circled in red now. The Initiate will add this number to the evasion of its target, in this case the Tremor. The Tremor has an evasion of 6, the Initiate has an attack ability of 6. If we add these two numbers together, we get our target number, in this case 6 plus 6, which is 12. The Initiate would have to roll a 12 or lower in order to hit the Tremor. Let's say that he does. The Tremor would then have to make an armor save. To make an armor save, the Tremor would take its armor value, in this case 16, and subtract the strength, or ST, of the Initiate's melee weapon, in this case 4. 16 minus 4 is 12. Our target number is once again 12. In this case, the Tremor would have to roll 12 or lower in order to not lose a hit point. As you can see, the Tremor has 2 hit points, so even if it failed, it would still have 1 hit point left and not be downed. In Sunshard Embren, when a model would get to 0 hit points, it is instead down. When a model is downed, it gains blight tokens at the end of each round. If a downed model would lose another hit point, or if a model ever gets to 3 blight tokens, even if it's not dying, it is immediately killed and removed from the table. This is something unique to Sunshard Embren, and it comes up a lot in the battle report, so I wanted to highlight it here. First, let's look at the scenario, or quest as Sunshard Embren refers to these as, before we start looking at the table and the models that'll be played. Today, Andrew and I are going to be playing the Steady Advance quest. This quest is pretty simple. The goal is to advance across the table while keeping your own models alive and stopping your opponents from, well, being alive. It has a battlefield rule, which is a special rule that applies to the entire battlefield. In addition to the quest, Andrew and I can also earn victory points from secondary objectives, which in the Sunshard Embren game terms are called deeds. These can be things like killing a specific enemy model, being next to an objective of which will place 3 in the middle of the table, etc., etc. Rather than spending the entire video explaining all these different rules though, why don't we get into the game so that when the rules come up you can see how they affect things. Here's the table we're going to be playing on today. You can see there's 3 50mm objectives in the middle of the table, with bright green runes on them. Andrew and I rolled for Trapper's Den to determine what terrain is going to be hazardous. We came up with 5 pieces of terrain. Rather than going back and forth and each picking one, we decided for the sake of simplicity to just select the large rocks and the well as hazardous. Now, let's go over our respective forces. I'll be playing the Shardborn today. You can see the warband I'll be playing here. On the left, we have 2 blazes. These are fire elementals, fast, hard-hitting, but can't take much of a hit. In the middle, I have a locust. This will be the leader of my force. When we deploy our forces, we have to select one model to be the leader. As long as that model's on the battlefield, we gain a resource called Fortune, which lets us activate fortune abilities, including the ability to reroll missed attack rolls, failed armor saves, etc. As we'll see on the table too, we can also link up with other models even if we don't share a type with them. We'll explain that more as it comes up in the game. Last but certainly not least, we have the Tremors. These are earth elementals, a little bit slower than the blazes, but they're extremely tough, as you might expect. Now, let's take a look at the remnant force that Andrew's going to be piloting. Starting on the left, we have 2 initiates. These are the line troopers of the remnant. Jacks of all trade that do everything fairly well, but suffer significantly in terms of survivability. Next to them on the right is a tracker. This will be Andrew's leader. This is a generalist support piece that is also very mobile and is one of the hardest hitting melee models in Andrew's warband. To the right of him is a hound. This is a melee missile. These are somewhat disposable, fast, hard hitting, but really cannot take a punch. Last but not least, on the far right is a dervish. With the right setup, this can be one of the most threatening melee models in the game. However, if you don't use good positioning, like many elves, he can be a bit of a glass cannon. Now, let's take a look at deployment. Andrew and I each rolled a d20. Andrew got a 2 and I got an 11, so Andrew won the roll for deployment. Andrew elected to deploy the first model and placed his dervish down on the table. I then placed a blaze down. Then Andrew placed a hound. After that, you'll see that I deployed my entire force. First, 2 tremors and a remaining blaze, and then last but not least, the locust. The locust has the Shardbringer 2 ability, which means he brings 2 50mm size pieces of terrain that have the seeded terrain rule. This is really important for the Shardborn special rules, as we'll see on the table. Once that was done, Andrew deployed the rest of his force because the remaining models in his force have the Ranger special ability, which lets models deploy after everything else has been deployed without Ranger, up to 6 inches away from his deployment zone. This can be really helpful in establishing a strong board position. After deployment, we started the first round. Before anything else happens, we go through the start phase. During the start phase, because Andrew and I both have a leader model on the table, we each gain a fortune. Fortune is a resource that can be used to activate fortune abilities, such as re-rolling a missed attack roll, or some special factional abilities. After the start phase, we then enter the initiative phase. Both Andrew and I rolled a d20. I rolled a 2, Andrew rolled an 11, so I won initiative because I rolled lower. I can now either decide to activate one of my models, or have Andrew activate one of his models. I told Andrew to activate his dervish because I wanted to see where it was going to go, which Andrew did. Andrew has some decisions to make. The dervish has 3 action points. Andrew decides to spend 1 action point on movement, which allows him to move the dervish up to its speed in inches. The dervish has a speed of 4, so he moves the dervish up 4 inches. He then spends his last 2 action points to take the special action Go On Guard. The dervish now has an On Guard token. This token can be spent to react to certain abilities of enemy models, which we'll see a little bit later in the game. It's now my turn to activate a model. I select the Tremor on the left side of the battlefield. The Tremor spends 2 of its 3 action points on move action. He has a speed of 3, so he moves up to a total of 6 inches. He's in contact with one of the objectives, but not within it, so he doesn't have to worry about taking a hazardous check. He's also in contact with one of the seeded terrain markers, which trigger his Shard focus abilities, including gaining +2 armor and having the Bodyguard special rule, which will let him take a range attack hit for another model within 3 inches. Next, he tries to score a deed, Recon in particular, which it lets you take a 0 AP special action to make a resolution check, although it's at a pretty steep -6 modifier. Unfortunately, the Tremor doesn't make this test. However, there's no penalty for failing. Lastly, with his last action point, he makes another resolution check, this one without a modifier, and this one he makes. This is to score one of the Shardborn faction-specific deeds called Shard Seeding. There's now a Shard Seed marker on the objective. If, at the end of any round, all 3 objectives have Shard Seed markers on them, the Shardborn will score a victory point and gain a fortune. It's a nice little side effect of scoring some of these deeds. That's the end of the Tremor's activation. Back over to Andrew. Andrew now activates his tracker. The tracker, starting in contact with one of the objectives, also tries to score the Recon deed. Unfortunately, the tracker wasn't any more successful than the Tremor was at finding some new reconnaissance information. Next, Andrew makes an attack with his first action point, targeting the Tremor that just moved up. He's using his Mark Target range attack, which can apply the Hunter's Mark, a special effect, if it hits. Andrew gets lucky and does hit the Tremor. The Tremor now has a Mark Target token on it, which gives all Remnant models +2 to hit when they target the Tremor. The Hunter's Mark weapon has the Fade weapon ability on it, which now lets Andrew's tracker move 2 inches in any direction he'd like, which he does. Andrew then moves 4 inches, ending within 2 inches of the Tremor. Because the tracker has the Reach weapon ability, he can make attacks and charges from up to 2 inches away. Because he ended engaging within 2 inches of the Tremor, he can now make a melee attack without spending any action points, and it's at +1 AA and +1 strength. Unfortunately for the tracker, he gets unlucky and misses the attack. Andrew, not wanting to risk the tracker to a counterattack, decides to spend his last action point to move. Because the Tremor's not engaging him, he doesn't have to take the disengage special action, he can just move away. He moves 4 inches back into base contact with the objective. Additionally, at the end of his activation, Andrew uses one of the Remnant Fortune abilities, which allows a model at the end of its activation to spend a fortune and gain an on-guard token, just like the Dervish. This will give an extra layer of protection to the tracker for the coming round. That means it's over to me. I decide to activate my Tremor, who forms a party with the Blaze and Locust nearby. Because the Blaze and Locust are within 4 inches of the Tremor when it starts its activation, they can be selected to form a party. Up to 3 models other than the model initially selected to activate can be chosen when forming a party, with the exception of when a leader is the one forming a party who can pick up to 4 other models. The Tremor has to go first because it's the model that formed the party. It spends 2 of its AP to move 6 inches in base contact with the seated terrain marker, and then ends its activation. Up next is the Blaze. The Blaze activates, spends 2 AP on movement, and ends in base contact with Andrew's Initiate. As Andrew said, "Oh no!" The Blaze has an attack ability of 5, and Andrew's Initiate has an evasion of 3. Adding in the bonus for charging of +1 AA gives the Blaze approximately a 45% chance to hit for each attack it makes. However, the Blaze has the powerful 2 weapon ability, which lets it roll 2 dice when it makes an attack with its Flame Invocation weapon, which it's going to do here. Surprisingly, the Blaze rolls a 2 and a 4 for the 2 dice for this attack, both of which hit. Andrew now needs to make 2 separate armor tests. He fails the first, which now results in the Initiate going downed and having a floored marker, which represents it being on the ground. You're not usually standing when you're dying. The second test he also fails, which kills the model and removes it from the table. At this point, the Blaze scores the Glory Kill deed, because the Blaze only costs 2 points, while the Initiate costs 3. That gets 1 victory point for me. Hooray! The Blaze then attempts to perform recon because it's in base contact with an objective. However, much like the Tremor, it also fails in this endeavor. Last in the party is the Locust. The Locust activates, spends 1 action point to move, its speed of 4 inches, and then spends its last 2 action points to take the On Guard special action. Thanks to the Locust's phase-forming special ability, it can now pick one of 3 terrain rolls and apply that to any seated terrain within 6 inches of it as long as it has an on-guard token. It selects the hazardous terrain roll, which means the 2 50mm objectives are now hazardous. They're only hazardous to Andrew, however, thanks to the Shardwalker special ability, which all models in the Shardborn faction have. This ability lets them ignore the hazardous and rugged terrain rules, which is really handy when you're moving around your markers, as you'll see me do at the start of the next round. It's now Andrew's turn, who wants some revenge. He has the Hound charge the Blaze that just kills his Initiate and makes his 2 attacks thanks to the powerful charge rule, which give him the powerful 2 weapon ability on attacks made during a charge. These both hit. Andrew passes 1 armor test but fails the other, putting his Blaze downed and as well as floored, which will make him easier for any follow-up attacks. The Hound then attempts recon and fails. Up next, I activate my last model that has not activated, which is the Blaze on the left. This walks over and positions itself for next turn, not doing anything else. Last but not least, Andrew activates his Initiate. The Initiate attempts to throw a spear at the Blaze, who is engaged with the Hound and is on the floor. Unfortunately, the spear misses. Andrew attempts recon because he's in base contact with an objective. This also fails. You'll see this is a theme throughout the battle report. And last but not least, he spends his final 2 action points to go on guard. That's all the models that have to activate this round. At the end of the round, we now check effects which trigger during the end phase. 2 key things happen now. First, the Blaze is downed, and during the end phase, if you're downed, you'll gain a Blight token. If a model ever has 3 Blight tokens, it is killed and removed from the table. This is probably unlikely to happen because the Blaze is likely to be killed next round, but it's still a good thing to keep track of. Last, we'll check if any victory points are scored from the quest or deeds. In this case, Andrew scores the Vigilance deed, which is a Remnant-specific deed because he has 2 models with on-guard tokens in contact with objectives. The score is now 1 victory point to 1 victory point. Andrew has no fortune at the moment, whereas I have a single fortune, which will come in handy just in a second. It's now the start of turn 2. During the start phase, at the beginning of the start phase, I spend the fortune that I have to move one of the seeded terrain markers up to 5 inches from its current position using one of the Shardborn fortune abilities. The locust is still on guard, so this is still hazardous terrain for Andrew. This could really put a wrench into his plans. Up next, we each get 1 fortune, so we're each back to having 1 fortune apiece, thanks to both of our leaders still being on the table. We then roll for initiative, which Andrew wins. Andrew really wants revenge for his initiate, so he activates the Hound first. The Blaze is currently dying and floored, which makes him a little bit easier to hit. The Hound attacks, hits, and unfortunately Andrew fails his armor save. Because the Blaze is 2 points and the Hound is 1, Andrew scores Glory Kill. The Hound then attempts to recon and fails yet again. He doesn't have anything great to do with his last action point, so he just hangs out and passes the activation over to me. I decide to form a party, starting with the Locust, who forms a party with the Tremor and the Blaze. Both the Tremor and Blaze are the elemental type. Normally I'd have to spend a fortune to do this because the Locust is a warlord type. However, because the Locust is my leader, he gains the commander ability, which means I do not have to spend a fortune when I mix types in a party. This is very handy. The Locust is going to go first. However, the initiate has an on-guard token and decides to interrupt his activation before he can spend his first AP to throw a spear at him. The spear hits the Locust, but I pass my armor save. However, because of the fade rule on the thrown spear weapon of the initiate, he can now move up to 2 inches, which he does. This changes my game plan, so I decide to move up and engage the tracker using the Locust. However, when I do this, Andrew decides to, once I get within 2 inches, use the Held Strike on guard ability that he has to try to make an attack before I'm able to close the distance to him. Andrew passes the necessary resolution check, but misses his attack roll. This could be devastating for Andrew, so he spends his fortune to re-roll the attack. By doing so, he hits, and he actually wounds the Locust. This is not looking good for me. Lastly, because of the Fade weapon ability, Andrew is able to move his tracker back 2 inches, which severely compromises my game plan. The Locust finishes its declared movement onto the objective, which requires it to pass a armor test because of the hazardous terrain rule. It passes the test. The Locust then attempts the recon deed, and like every other model of this game, fails. Lastly, it uses its final AP to make an attack using its range attack, which it's able to do because it's in contact with seeded terrain at the initiate. Unfortunately, it misses. Next up in the party is the Blaze, which charges the tracker. Vroom vroom! One of its attacks hits, and unfortunately for the tracker, it has a botched save, so in addition to taking a wound, it also gains a blight token. Finally, the Tremor activates. It spends 2 action points to move into base contact with the objective, tries recon, fails yet again, and lastly, takes the Shard Seeding special action. This passes and puts a Shard Seed marker on the objective. Only 1 more marker to go before I score this deed. That's the end of all 3 models in my party, so now it's Andrew's turn to activate a model. Andrew activates his Dervish. The Dervish decides to charge the Tremor. The Dervish is going to benefit from a tremendous number of buffs to its AA. It has a base AA of 6, it's charging, which makes it 7. There's a marked target token on the Tremor, which takes it to 9, and then because of the finish rule, gets a further +2 AA, bringing it to 11. Adding the Tremor's evasion, it needs a 17 or lower to hit. Surprisingly, it only hits with 1 of the 2 attacks thanks to the powerful weapon ability. Aw shucks. The Tremor somehow fails the armor save required for this. The Dervish uses its second action point to attack again. This time both attacks hit, although they're a little less powerful because it's no longer benefiting from the charging bonus. The first armor test for the Tremor fails. I really don't want to lose the Tremor here if I can avoid it, so I spend a fortune to reroll this. Unfortunately, even after the reroll, I still fail, which puts me into dying. However, the second hit I do save. The Dervish then spends its last action point to attack me yet again, both of which hit. I fail the first one, which kills the Tremor. This immediately scores the Prey deed for Andrew, which gets him 1 victory point, as well as a fortune. Good show. It's my turn to activate a model, and I'll activate the last model that I have, the Tremor. The Tremor tries to charge the initiate. One of the 2 attacks it can make, thanks to the powerful 2 weapon ability, does hit, but unfortunately, the Initiate, surprisingly, saves against this attack. This is not going my way, it seems. Andrew decides to form a party between the Initiate and the Tracker, which he can do without spending his fortune, thanks to the Tracker being a leader, even though those are 2 different types of model. The Tracker activates first. When it got hit by the blaze, it gained a burning counter, which would mean if it took any action other than the rally special action, it would take functionally a strength 4 hit. It decides to make the rally action with its first action point to avoid this fate. With its second action point, it makes an attack using its spear against the blaze. This hits, and unfortunately the blaze fails its armor test, thus going into downed and dying. Because of the Fade weapon ability, the Tracker can move up to 2 inches. Thanks to 2-inch reach, it's still within range to make another attack, which it does. This one's a little easier to hit, and once again it hits. Once again the blaze fails its armor test, thus killing the blaze. Thanks to the Fade ability, the Tracker can now move another 2 inches, which it does, and this lets Andrew score the Hit and Run deed, which is scored when a model moves 4 inches or more with the Fade weapon ability, which Andrew just did. Last but not least is Andrew's Initiate. The Initiate decides to stand and deliver against the Tremor and attacks it. Its first attack misses, but the second attack hits, which applies a bleeding counter, which we'll get to in a second. Thankfully, I save this hit with the Tremor. Andrew's third attack misses, thus ending all the activations for the models that we have on the table. This puts us into the end phase. Several things happen during the end phase. Firstly, the Tremor needs to resolve its bleeding counter. It makes a condition test. On a 10 or lower, the bleeding counter is just removed. However, on an 11 or higher, the Tremor will take a wound and then the bleeding counter is removed. The Tremor rolls an 8, so thankfully it does not take a wound thanks to the bleeding counter. Phew! We now check for victory points due to quest or deeds. I scored Crystal Migration because I moved a seated terrain marker across the center line at the beginning of the turn. I also score Advance because all my models without downed tokens on them are across the center line. I also score 3 victory points thanks to the quest because I have at least one model within my half of contested ground. Andrew is going to score Bedlam because I only have 2 models left on the table. He is also going to score 3 victory points thanks to the quest. This results in a score of 8 victory points for Andrew and 6 victory points for me. It's not looking good, but anything can still happen. Alright, so that then takes us to the start of round 3. We both gain a fortune again because both of our leaders are on the table, and then roll for initiative. I won the initiative this round, so I'm going to decide to go first. I'm going to form a party with my Locust and Tremor and see what I can do. The Locust decides to charge the Dervish. The Locust's elemental attack weapon has the powerful 2 ability. He swings 2 times on the Dervish with his charge and unfortunately misses both. He spends a second action point to swing again, and once again misses both attacks. He decides to spend a fortune to reroll those because I'd really like to put the Dervish down if possible. On rerolling, he misses both attacks yet again, needing only an 8 to hit. This is improbable, but these things can happen. The Locust spends its last action point to swing one more time on the Dervish. This time I hit both attacks, rolling a 2 and a 6. The Dervish fails its first armor test but passes its second. The Dervish has 2 hit points, so it's still standing. This is unfortunate luck. Up next we have the Tremor. It attacks the Initiate. Surprisingly, my luck improving, I hit with both attacks, one of which rolled a 3. The Tremor has the Bell Ringer 5 ability, which means if it rolls a 5 or under, in addition to any other effects, the Initiate will be floored or knocked down. The Initiate then rolls its 2 armor tests. The first one it botches with a roll of a 20, so it gains a Blight token in addition to be wounded. The second test it also fails, so the Initiate is just dead. The Tremor then charges onto the objective, which is a hazardous terrain element, and it needs to make an armor check as a result. It fails this unfortunately, taking a wound. This is unfortunate. It then charges the Tracker, hits with one of the 2 dice, which the tracker then fails its resulting armor check. Unfortunately, the tracker would now be put into downed if fails this. It would really like to avoid that, so Andrew spends a fortune to re-roll the armor check. Unfortunately for Andrew, even with the re-roll, it still fails. The tracker is now downed and floored. The Tremor then, with his last action point, decides to make one last set of attacks. Unfortunately, both of these miss, rolling a 14 and a 16. Aw shucks. The Dervish is then nominated to go. At the start of its activation, the Dervish uses one of the Remnant Fortune abilities to put a Mark Target token onto the Locust. It then attacks the Locust, missing both attacks. This is a very unusual game for dice, it seems. The next attack it makes causes 2 hits. Thanks to the Tremor being in sharded terrain though, it has the Bodyguard special ability, which it's going to use to take one of the hits for the Locust. The hit that the Tremor takes is saved. However, unfortunately, the hit that the Locust took is not saved, putting it into downed and floored as well. With the last action point it has, the Dervish then makes one more attack, both of which hit, and unfortunately the Locust fails its first armor check. This kills it. This also results in the Remnant scoring the Headhunter deed, giving them another victory point. Last to activate is the Hound. The Hound spends both its action points to charge the Tremor. Unfortunately, both of these attacks miss. This takes us to the end phase. The tracker is going to gain its second Blight token because if you remember, it had gotten one earlier in the round thanks to a botch save. Up next, we count victory points. Andrew and I once again both score 3 victory points from the quest. Then we noticed after the fact that I had actually scored the Force of Nature deed when the Tremor had made an attack action that caused a wound while within seeded terrain. As a result, the score was now 12 victory points for Andrew and 10 for me. We're moving into the last round because the quest indicates this should only be played for 4 rounds. There might be a chance for me to catch up, but it's not looking likely. At the start of round 4, neither of us gain a fortune because my leader is dead and Andrew's is downed. So unfortunately, neither of us are going to get any rerolls this round, which heightens the tension. We then roll for initiative, which I won. I chose to activate my Tremor first because it's the only model I can activate. The Tremor decides to attack the Hound because it has the best chance of putting it down. It swings once, missing with both dice, swings again, hitting once, and unfortunately the Hound is able to save this attack, rolling a 2. What are the odds? The last attack hits, rolling a 4, which triggers the Bellringer ability, meaning the Hound is going to be floored no matter what, and then the Hound fails its armor save. At least the Hound won't be able to attack me back. Andrew then activates the Dervish because it's the only model he has which can activate. The Dervish makes an attack, both of which hit the Tremor, and the Tremor saves both. Makes a second attack, only one of which hits the Tremor, and the Tremor saves this as well. Its final attack unfortunately misses both times. It's unfortunate Andrew does not have any fortune to reroll these, but this is the game. We now move to the end phase. During the end phase, Andrew's tracker gains its third and final Blight token, which kills it. As a result, looking at the table, I then score Headhunter because Andrew's leader has been killed, as well as Bedlam because Andrew only has 2 models left. We both score another 3 victory points thanks to the quest. As a result, the end of the game is actually a tie, with both of us having 15 victory points. What an exhilarating game! We decided that at the end of the game, both of our forces were satisfied with the performance we put out, but neither of us gained significant ground. The Remnant had hunted several dangerous beasts, with the Dervish proving his worth at the end of the battle. In contrast, the Shardborn had spread their crystals over the terrain that they had met the Remnant on, working towards their inscrutable ends. We hope you found this battle report interesting and informative. If you have any questions or want to learn more about our game, head over to immanitize.games, our website, where you can download the rules and model cards for free. Alternatively, hop over to our Discord, link in the description, where you can talk to us and other people who are enthusiastic about the game. Thanks for checking this out. We hope to hear from you soon.